Well, this video started out as a Red Shoes video, a video on the beauty of the 1948 movie directed by Pressburger and Powell, and production designed by Heckroth. Ugh. It's really uncomfortable to sit on the floor, you know? Whatever. And you know, we will cover it, but I want to tell you right away that even though it was going to be a visual analysis of a movie when I started this, it's ended up being a commentary and a lot more than that. So strap in. This movie is quite famous. Chances are you've seen it if you've heard of it. But for those of you who are unfamiliar, The Red Shoes is a movie written about a young ballerina that is torn between her love of art and dance and her love for a composer that she meets while being a prima ballerina. The name of the movie actually comes from Hans Christian Andersen, one of his fairy tales. The ballet portion of the movie is what I want to focus on today and talk about. The performance of the Red Shoes piece is actually 15 minutes long, and it is uninterrupted performance. Maybe it doesn't seem like that long, but it's actually really rare to see that in a movie that is not about just filming a production of a ballet piece. If you have a performance in the middle of the movie, it's usually short. You usually get the most important parts shown to you and everything else gets cut out. Here, on the other hand, we get to see the entirety of the piece. This movie is literally over 2 hours long, and also the story itself is only loosely related to the Red Shoes. It is kind of related through the Red Shoes entirely, really. So the symbolism of how they relate to each other, it's not as important, especially not for this video because we're going to be focusing on the visuals. Let's take a look at the most important and interesting parts of the performance, at least in my opinion. Obviously, this is going to be filtered through my perception of this performance. This stage performance is a blend of hyper artificiality, of painted sets, and full stage camera shots, combined with matte painting, which allowed for masking and editing back in the day. At first, the ballet starts with scenes that, although colorful and already full of impressionistic qualities, still shows imagery grounded in reality. Vicky moves through the carnival and she ends up in the square again. And at this point, she's already unable to stop dancing because of the red shoes that she put on. Vicky portrays a character that's unable to stop dancing, but at the same time, she becomes one with her. She sees the shoemaker that gave her the red shoes transform into Lermontov, the ballet director, then morph into a composer that she fell in love with. With the sudden morphing of reality and fiction, we are introduced to the first scene that leans heavily into the surrealist influences, implying that we are now inside the character's psyche. This is one of my favorite scenes, so listen up. Quite obviously, this scene is a composite shot. Moira Shearer, the main character here, is not lit up in the same way as the rest of the scene, but the color work is done in such a way that genuinely makes it feel like the entire scene is this surrealist / impressionistic painting come to life. This is honestly one of the most stunning scenes ever. I really enjoy the way that it is done. I think a huge part of that is how the flatness and depth are masterfully blended to create a feeling of painted texture in the most physical way possible. The next scene is her dancing with a piece of newspaper that twists and turns until it morphs into a man. Of course, a part of the reason why these older effects work for me here anyway, regardless of being a bit more jarring, is due to how much they relied on practical effects. I personally like when people try to paint and build and create as many things as possible to be real in movies or in any other type of art form, mostly because of how much of our current art is less than real life renderings of a fantasy thing and more of a phantom work that relies on hyperrealism more than on aesthetic values. Vicky runs towards the camera, surrounded by a scenery that reads as a road in a busy city in the middle of the night. This staging is absolutely gorgeous. One of those sets that really get your creative synapses firing again, even in the midst of a creative stupor. Of course, there are some aspects of the ballet and the film that are problematic, like a brief blackface use in the ballet portion. And I have talked about this already before on my podcast when we talked about killing the author, the separation of author and art, and if it's actually even possible, and if so, how can we do that? If you want to have that discussion, you can go over there. Now, what I find really interesting in this scene is the use of paint and lighting. Perspective is both real and illusionary. We get lampposts that are placed in a way that draws the eye in, and obviously Shure can move inside the scene, but it is still visible that it's a stage with backdrops. This combination of real and unreal, of real depth and simulated depth, really makes the scene memorable, especially with the use of blue in the background and yellow light on the figures. And a minute later, we're introduced to this scene, which is probably my favorite of them all. This cliffside, or whatever the hell you can call this island in the middle of a bunch of canyons. The transition here is absolutely gorgeous. Music, choreography, and the visuals all converging in one rhythmic moment to emphasize the appearance of a magical scene painted with a lot of thick brushstroke lines. Honestly, what really makes it, at least in my opinion, is Vicky's silhouette, her shadow that is cast upon the cliffside. It creates the most interesting perspective and underlines the movement of the actress slash dancer performer. The golden curtain scene that follows is a perfect moment to bring up Heckroth's sketches that he's made more than 2,000 of for this production for just these 15 minutes. I love when people who lean into surrealist or impressionistic type of approaches really show dedication. I cannot stand a lazy bitch that's just pretending to be a surrealist or claiming to be a surrealist just because they don't want to do things in a deliberate fashion. The camera is then spun around and we get to see the edge of the stage lit up with ballet's composer and maestro conducting the orchestra. He enters the stage but morphs into the main dancer, the male dancer that danced with Vicky the entire time before, quite literally showing that he steps into the shoes of the lover figure in this ballet. When he leaves, the stage is hit by waves from the orchestral pit. She dances and dances until she can't dance anymore, and then dies when her shoes are finally taken off. What is so exceptional about this movie is the combination of dance, music, painting, and film. Heckroth himself was trained as a painter, and you can quite obviously see that in the style of set design that he decided to go for. His contribution is actually what makes the ballet work in this movie, in my opinion. The combination of so many different art mediums garnered some criticism because of how much of purity of different art forms needed to be compromised to make this work. Specifically, critics who were interested in the choreography had a lot to say about this movie and the use of ballet in it. For many people who enjoy choreographies as a separate art form, filming ballet from any other perspective than the perspective of the audience is basically blasphemous. But some people were receptive to this combination anyway. I personally think that if a movie or a film of ballet is made, it needs to be made as a film instead of trying to replicate the experience of seeing ballet live, because that's just not going to be the same anyway. The reason for it is that there's no way around the Gesamtkunstwerk of the whole situation. Do you know what I mean? Like, it is always going to be one of those things that I genuinely think need to be thought of every time you make something that requires multiple art forms to be in one. Even when you are more of a purist in terms of focusing on one art movement or art medium at a time, I think that you still have to accept the fact that you're gonna have to think about the entirety of the artwork in the context of where it is. I know this might seem like a bit too much of nitpicking for many people, but for artists, there's always a bunch of rules of how their art is supposed to function, and especially when you're an artist who's honing in a skill and really focuses on that one skill. For dancers who have been trained classically, if you can't see the entire body in the frame, you might as well stop filming. This is where we have to talk about reproducibility of art and how much it changed when it escalated. In 1935, Walter Benjamin, a critic and philosopher, wrote this paper called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. This is a famous work that is constantly discussed in visual art circles, and of course, it is very dense. It's hard to address everything in one video, but we don't have to because we're focusing on a very specific thing today. I had to close the window and my legs are asleep, so I'm gonna sit like this for a while. This paper basically covers the impact that photography and film had on painting and theater respectively, and that impact being brought forth in a way that makes the active making of an artwork only necessary to be performed once for reproduction. However, for the purposes of this video, the most important parts of this essay are 8 to 12, mostly because they focus on the actor, a performer whose performance became fragmented and challenged by the invention of film. An actor would be the closest parallel to a dancer, at least in this case. And an actor's performance would be the closest parallel to a dancer's choreography. The artistic performance of a stage actor is definitely presented to the public by the actor in person. That of the screen actor, however, is presented by a camera with a twofold consequence. The camera that presents the performance of the film actor to the public need not respect the performance as an integral whole. In our case, an actor is also a dancer, and they are at the mercy of a camera. There's a huge difference between having an audience that can decide themselves what they want to focus on, the entirety of the stage being in front of them, and a film where directors decided what is going to be in the shot. Not only that, but for the screen, a lot of actors and dancers have to be working in a very fragmented fashion that's unnatural to their performance. Sometimes you only need to do half a step in a choreography, or read only one line while looking at a camera in a certain way. Sometimes you have to perform as if you're talking to the other actor in the scene, when in reality you're staring right in the barrel of the camera. Can we fix it? Baby, can we fix it? This is something that the directors of the Red Shoes actually discussed with monk Gibbon for the Red Shoes critical study book. It is true, of course, that since the whole training of ballet dancer is in one sense fragmentary, the execution of a particular part of a movement taken out of its context may come more easily to him than it would to an actor forced to record a Shakespearean soliloquy a line at a time. Obviously, it's not surprising that these conversations came up in interviews, but it is quite satisfying to see that the directors of this movie actually had an understanding and gave a lot of thought to the fact that they're dealing with two distinct types of ballet. One is live and in person, and another one is created to be reproduced and replayed. Any thorough study proves that there is indeed no greater contrast than that of the stage play to a work of art that is completely subject to, or, like the film, founded in mechanical reproduction. While facing the camera, the actor knows that ultimately they will face the public, the consumers who constitute the market. This market, where they offer not only their labor but also their whole self, their heart and soul, is beyond their reach. During the shooting, they have as little contact with it as any article made in a factory. This performance becomes a commodity quite obviously. And this theory or this analysis that Benjamin is presenting here is not entirely bulletproof, mostly because a lot of the examples here are based on assumptions. Some assumptions, don't get me wrong, I actually think that this is well written. Okay? Technically speaking, if there is an audience to view a performance, even if it's live, it's still a commodity to at least a certain extent, right? Just because a dance hasn't been recorded doesn't mean that it hasn't also been paid for as for an experience. Or this whole idea of how the aura is diminished by reproduction and that it is not the same impact than the original. Obviously, when something is created to be reproduced, you cannot really claim for it to be original, but this is where I'm thinking this whole idea of aura can be a little bit tricky and a little bit too ephemeral to really pin it down well enough for it to be a centerpiece of this paper, which I actually don't think that aura is a centerpiece of this paper at all, by the way. I think that people love to focus on it because they don't want to actually talk about what is the focus of this paper. But I think that considering the rest of Benjamin's argument, he is speaking from a perspective of someone who lived at a time when film was a reproducible type of art, accessible to audiences for viewing. Like, you can go and purchase a ticket and watch a movie, but not accessible to the general public to create. So technically speaking, everyone could be a critic, but no one could become the subject of the reproduced art unless their image was stripped of their aura and they were created into a different image that would be appealing enough to a wide enough audience that you could be profitable for a studio to do all that work to give you a name that's actually associated with something. Walter Benjamin says, "We do not deny that in some cases today's films can also promote revolutionary criticism of social conditions, even of the distribution of property. However, Our present study is no more specifically concerned with that than is the film production of Western Europe. In cinematic practice, particularly in Russia, this changeover has partially become established reality. Some of the players whom we meet in Russian films are not actors in our sense, but people who portray themselves, and primarily in their own work process. In Western Europe, the capitalistic exploitation of the film denies consideration to modern man's legitimate claim to being reproduced. In many ways, making a film that doesn't have any famous actors in it would hurt its marketability, making it hard to gather money that is needed to actually create it. But film, just like architecture, permeates the fabric of everyday life, making it one of the most influential art forms today, specifically because it can be consumed in an absent-minded fashion that makes all of those ideas still part of daily routine. But making something that has wide appeal usually requires a cult of personality, whether it is through an actor who plays in the film, or a director that is well known and has a certain reputation, or some other means of producing, a very appealing image, something popular enough that you could sell. You can make a film that is more real. You can make a film that has something specific that it presents to the public about people in it, without losing the aura of the work per se, or of the performance, but that would make the production unfavored by the market, because it's not something that's been made to produce capital, but rather to produce art. And it is quite obvious, but we have to still mention it, right? Well, this is still technically a discussion of Benjamin's work, because he goes from explaining images and their transition from being produced at a slower pace to a really quick pace, to talking about capital, the creation of more masses of proletariat people, and their organization into an impotent group that can't really influence the realities of society, while still having a feeling that they do. He goes from one to another really quickly. I literally got whiplash from it, but we've actually never discussed the implications of the epilogue of this text in university when we studied it. It's really interesting that they just kind of cut out most of the important parts for some fucking reason. I don't know why. Considering that futurism and art movement that we actually studied was so tightly woven into the same ideological tapestry as fascism. What Benjamin is arguing when writing the epilogue to this paper, a paper that analyzes film and other reproducible types of art, is that they present not only distributable type of art, but also art that can be created a lot faster. Speed becomes a very huge factor. While the moment in time that is captured on film can be picked up and moved from its context and its time frame, like in our case with the red shoes, it can be analyzed and watched almost 80 years in the future, it makes it so detached from any moment in a historical sense. Honestly, the difference in the impact of these works of art, it's really hard for us to comprehend, because we live in an age where it is so normal to have this accessibility to literally any artwork at any time. Well, most of them anyway. The existence of this accessibility to this art is more important than its existence in real life. It's an extreme aestheticization of art, when it honestly doesn't matter if it can't be even made. What matters is that it can be watched or perceived. And yes, there were a lot of people who responded to Benjamin and talked about how this accessibility is good because it democratizes art, or it makes it more accessible to everyone. Like, how could it be bad? And this isn't what makes it bad. It actually isn't bad on its own. Benjamin doesn't actually deny the importance or the good of accessibility of art. He literally says so himself, as I've said previously. Like, I literally read the quote from his writing that entirely shuts down those types of assumptions, which is really interesting to read when you know how many think pieces and responses people wrote to him throughout this century, basically showing that they didn't read the original text. I don't understand why. I don't understand why people can't even do that. But, considering that I'm working on the internet, I speak to people online, I present ideas online, I know that, yeah, people sometimes just don't fucking listen, and then they come up with an idea that they assume you tried to sell to them, which you didn't. Even though there is this reproducibility, you still have to understand that the production itself is still going to be gatekept. And even if it's not gatekept, you're still going to see that a lot of films, for example, that get popular are the ones that have the widest appeal, which means that they have the most aesthetic value or the most aesthetic prioritization to compare to its actual value in terms of its contextual commentary. And by contextual commentary, I mean that they're not just yapping without it being within a historical context. Any movie that is not aware of when it's being made, it's all gonna be art that's convenient to the capital, not art that honestly has more artistic value, right? And mostly it's not even that it's like stupid or something, but it's art that's prioritizing speed of production and its distribution potential. To make a thing that actually has a lot of artistic skill there, a lot of merit, you have to give enough freedom to the artists that are working on that project to create something good, which means that they need time, they need resources, and it all comes down to budgets. So if you want to achieve some certain aesthetic quality, right, it comes with the price of mostly compromising artistic integrity. Regardless of all of that, the reason why he even brings up futurism as an art movement in the epilogue and shows specific excerpts from Futurist Manifesto is to show that this prioritization of less substance and more wide appeal to the senses, more appreciation for the speed of production, shows that this highly aesthetic art that has this classical value, by which I mean that people consider it timeless, you know, that word, timeless, valuable only for the sake of what it looks like, basically. Outside of its historical context, outside of its political context, it's exactly what tricks the masses into feeling like there's real expression going on. This is going back all the way back to my video on Hollywood's obsession with fake rebellion. It pacifies people, even encourages them to become artists who are far removed from taking any action. People who are entirely detached from their context and who they are as a person outside of their artist's pursuits. It's the whole statue of David profile picture on Twitter of it all, you know?
Oh, that's grotesque.
It's this idea that your art has value contextless. It has value because of its listlessness, and it appeals to everyone, making you the safest bet for capital to invest into. Therefore, making art more and more of a, decorative thing. And this is why Benjamin even brings, fascism into conversation here. Because even though it's like a little bit of a difficult concept to grasp in terms of how fast we jump from one to another, it is actually quite clear when you start to look at what kind of art can be produced when only speed, technology, and progress that is devoid of being informed by what the world is actually looking like right now is prioritized. Fascism sees its salvation in giving these masses not their right, but instead a chance to express themselves. The masses have a right to change property relations. Fascism seeks to give them an expression while preserving property. The logical result of fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life. You literally don't have to have a point to your campaign. You literally don't have to, as long as you maintain a certain aesthetic. You also don't even have to have a point as to why you're creating conflict in the world. As long as you make people feel like they are a part of this aesthetic thing that you present in war movies, being a hero in aesthetic terms, the whole look at the flag, love the other shit, If the natural utilization of productive forces is impeded by the property system, the increase in technical devices, in speed, and in the source of energy will press for unnatural utilization. And this is found in war. Reminds you of something? I know, not AI again, I get it. But I do have to mention it because it's a natural progression of this conversation. Come on now. It's literally like an extreme side of this argument, you know? Not only is this art in the age of mechanical reproduction, it is art in the age of mechanical detachment. This obsession with useless progress, specifically listless, progress. This inability to utilize the technological advancements in a useful way instead of the destructive way makes it inevitable that it influences the way that art is viewed, consumed, and produced. Isn't it funny that it's always a very specific type of person who is interested in being an AI artist? I think it's kind of funny that they don't want to see how colossally this capital-driven society is failing at implementing technology into our lives to aid it, instead of making it a hellscape of unimaginable horrors. Instead of draining rivers, society directs a human stream into a bed of trenches. Instead of dropping seeds from airplanes, it drops incendiary bombs over cities. AI is not just detaching the aura from the object the way that reproduction does. Since honestly, it's not even an object, technically speaking, but it is detaching the artist altogether. Not only that, but it also disrespects all the artists that existed before and exist today, not by the fact that it produces art, really, but by the fact that it requires to consume art to spit it back out in weird combination. The detachment of the artist is honestly the ultimate wet dream of fascism. It's not just art or self-expression that's neutered, it's now requiring no skill, which means that it made the production times the fastest they've ever been. Who cares how bad a piece of art even is nowadays, because no one's gonna even look at it for longer than a second. Why do or make anything that creates life value if you can simply plunge the planet into further ecological disaster to create an alien with 15 tits? Anyway, now you can see why I had to switch things around, to accommodate a newish structure of a video, because it really stopped being about just aesthetics real quick. Did not realize how Benjamin's work was so far from what I was presented in university. Like, it genuinely isn't about aura. The way that it was presented to me was, the object loses its aura, so it's not as valuable as the original. And it's like, oh my God, the entire time, the conversation in class was literally just about the capital value of artworks, instead of talking about what the work is actually about. It's insane. Whatever. I don't know. We still enjoyed a little bit of, this visual eye candy at the beginning, just to lift our spirits a little. It didn't work much, but a little. Anyway, art only matters in context. I wish professors at my uni told us who futurists really are. And third of all, fuck futurists. Bye.